Hello, welcome back to the second section of The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Hope you enjoyed the first section of this one, and if you missed it, just go back one section. You can start from the beginning. And also, hi, I'm Julie. I read books over here. If you're new around here, we're glad to have you. If you like this book, give me a thumb. It helps me know what kind of books you like to read in the future, or comment how you're liking it so far. Comment what books you want me to read going forward. I know I have some requests for the Housemaid second book, so that will be hopefully coming in the future. But today we're continuing on with The General in His Labyrinth on page 25 if you are in a copy such as this one. If it's a different edition or copy, we've just gone over, I don't really know how to sum it up, but hopefully you'll be able to find it from the text. We're in just the very middle of the page, that paragraph starting there, and we're gonna hope that the street noise calms down. All right, here we go. During this time, his tenacious insomnia showed signs of disruption. He would fall asleep at any hour in the middle of a sentence while dictating a letter or during a card game, and even he was not really certain if they were sudden bursts of sleep or brief fainting spells. But as soon as he lay down, he felt overcome by a crisis of lucidity. He would just slip into a mire of half-sleep at daybreak until he was awakened again by the wind of peace in the trees. Then he did not resist the temptation to put off dictating his memoirs for yet another morning in order to take a solitary walk that sometimes lasted until lunchtime. He would go without an escort, without the two faithful dogs that had accompanied him even on the battlefield, without any of his epic horses, which had already been sold to the battalion of hussars to increase his travel funds. He would walk to the nearby river over the blanket of decayed leaves on the interminable tree-lined paths, protected from the icy savanna winds by the vicuña poncho, the boots lined with raw wool, and the green silk cap he used to wear only for sleeping. He would sit for a long while to meditate in the shade of the weeping willows, facing the narrow bridge made of loose planks, absorbed in the river currents he had once compared to the destiny of men. In a rhetorical simile worthy of his childhood tutor, Don Simon Rodriguez, one of his guards would follow him unseen until he returned soaked with dew and with a thread of breath almost too thin for him to climb the steps to the portico, haggard and dazed, but with the eyes of a happy madman. He felt so content during those evasive walks that the hidden guards would hear him through the trees, singing the soldiers' songs he used to sing in the years of his legendary glories and his Homeric defeats. Those who knew him best asked themselves the reason for his high spirits when Manuela herself doubted he would be confirmed another time as President of the Republic by a constituent Congress even he had described as admirable. On the day of the election, during his morning walk, he saw a greyhound without its owner chasing quail through the hedges. He called to it with a street corner whistle, and the animal made an abrupt stop, looked for him with ears erect, and found him with his poncho almost dragging on the ground, his cap worthy of a Florentine pontiff, forsaken by God between the swift-moving clouds and the immense plain. It smelled him with painstaking care while he caressed its coat with his fingertips. But then the dog leaped away in a sudden rush, looked into his eyes with its golden eyes, growled with suspicion, and fled in fear. He followed along an unfamiliar path that ended in a poor suburb of muddy, narrow streets and red-roofed adobe houses from whose patios rose the smell of milking. He heard the sudden shout, "Skinny Shanks!" He did not have time to dodge the cow manure that was hurled at him from a stable, smashed into the middle of his chest, and spattered his face. But it was the words more than the expression of dung that woke him from the stupor in which he had lived since leaving the presidential residence. He knew the nickname the New Grenadans had given him. It was the name of a madman famous for his theatrical uniforms. Even one of the senators who called themselves liberals had used the name in Congress in his absence, and only 2 men had stood up to protest, but he had never heard it in person. He began to wipe his face with the edge of the poncho, and had not yet finished when the unseen guard who was following him ran out from between the trees with his sword drawn to punish the insult. He turned on him in a burning flash of anger. "And what the hell are you doing here?" he asked. The officer snapped to attention. "I'm following your orders, Excellency." "I'm not your Excellency," he replied. He stripped him of his ranks and titles with so much rage that the officer considered himself fortunate that the general no longer had the strength for a more savage reprisal. Even Jose Palacios, who understood him so well, found it difficult to understand his severity. It was a disastrous day. He spent the morning walking around the house as distraught as when he was waiting for Manuela, but he concealed from no one that this time his longing was not for her, but for news from the Congress. Minute by minute, he attempted to calculate the detailed progress of the session. When Jose Palacios answered that it was 10 o'clock, he said, "No matter how the demagogues want to go on braying, they must have begun voting by now." Then, after a long period of reflection, he wondered aloud, "Who can know what a man like Urdaneta is thinking?" Jose Palacios knew that the general knew, because Urdaneta was still proclaiming far and wide the cause and extent of his resentment. Once, as Jose Palacios happened to be walking past, the general asked in an offhand manner, "Whom do you think Sucre will vote for?" Jose Palacios knew as well as he that Field Marshal Sucre could not vote, because he was on a congressional mission to Venezuela with the Bishop of Santa Marta, Monsignor Jose Maria Estevez, to negotiate the terms of that country's separation. And so he did not stop when he answered, "You know that better than anyone, senor." The general smiled for the first time since he had returned from his abominable walk. Despite his erratic appetite, he almost always sat at the table before 11 o'clock to eat a boiled egg with a glass of port, or to pick at a wedge of cheese. But that day, he watched the road from the terrace while the others had lunch, and he was so absorbed not even Jose Palacios dared to disturb him. It was past 3 o'clock when he heard the sound of the mule's hooves before he saw Manuela's carriage coming over the hills. And he leaped from the chair. He ran to receive her. He opened the door to help her down, and from the moment he saw her face, he knew. Don Joaquin Mosquera, the oldest son of an illustrious family from Popayan, had been elected president of the Republic by unanimous vote. His reaction was not so much anger or disillusion as astonishment, for he himself had suggested the name of Don Joaquin Mosquera to the Congress in the certainty he would not accept. He sank into deep thought, and he did not speak again until tea. "Not a single vote for me?" he asked. "Not a single one." Nevertheless, the official delegation of devoted deputies who visited him later explained that his followers had agreed to make the vote unanimous, so he would not appear to be the loser in a bitter contest. He was so irritated he did not seem to appreciate the subtlety of that gallant maneuver. He thought, instead, it would have been worthier of his glory if they had accepted his resignation the first time he offered it. "The long and short of it is," he sighed, "that the demagogues have won again, and twice over." Nevertheless, he was very careful to hide his consternation until he said goodbye to them on the portico. But their coaches had not been lost from view when he was struck down by a crisis of coughing that kept the manor house in a state of alarm until nightfall. One of the members of the official delegation had said that the decision of the Congress had been so prudent it had saved the Republic. He ignored the remark, But that night, while Manuela was obliging him to drink a cup of broth, he said to her, "No Congress ever saved a republic." Before going to bed, he assembled his aides and servants with the solemnity that was customary in his dubious renunciations. He announced, "Tomorrow I leave the country." It was not tomorrow, but 4 days later. In the meantime, he recovered his lost equanimity, dictated a farewell proclamation in which he did not betray the wounds to his heart, and returned to the city to prepare for the journey. General Pedro Alcantara Herran, Minister of the Army and Navy in the new government, brought him to his house on Calle la Enseñanza, not so much to offer hospitality as to protect him from the death threats that were becoming more and more alarming. Before leaving Santa Fe de Bogota, he liquidated the little of value he still owned in order to increase his treasury. In addition to the horses, he sold a silver service dating back to the lavish days of Potosi, which was appraised at 2,500 pesos by the mint for the simple value of the metal, without taking into account the beauty of its workmanship or its historic importance. When the final reckoning was made, he had 17,600 pesos and 60 centavos in cash, a draft for 8,000 pesos drawn on the public treasury of Cartagena, a pension for life granted him by the Congress, and a little over 600 ounces of gold distributed among various trunks. This was the woeful remnant of a personal fortune that on the day of his birth had been considered among the greatest in the Americas. On the morning of their departure, in the bags that Jose Palacios packed without haste while the general finished dressing, there were only 2 well-worn sets of underclothing, 2 changes of shirt, the battle tunic with a double row of buttons that were supposed to have been made from gold of Atahualpa, the silk cap for sleeping, and a red hood that Field Marshal Sucre had bought for him from Bolivia. His footwear consisted of his house slippers and the patent leather boots he would be wearing. In his personal trunks, Jose Palacios was carrying, along with the chest of medicines and a few other articles of value, Rousseau's Social Contract and the Art of War by the Italian general Raimundo Montecchioli, 2 bibliographical treasures that had belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte and had been given to him by Sir Robert Wilson, the father of his aide-de-camp. There was so little that it all fit into a soldier's knapsack. When he saw it as he was about to go to the room where the official delegation was waiting, he said, "We never would have believed, my dear Jose, that so much glory could fit into a shoe." His 7 pack mules, however, were carrying chests full of medals and gold tableware and numerous objects of a certain value, 10 trunks of private papers, 2 of books he had read, and at least 5 of clothing, and several chests with all manner of good and bad things that no one had the patience to tally. All of this, however, was not even a shadow of the baggage he had brought with him on his return from Lima 3 years earlier, when he was invested with triple power as President of Bolivia and Colombia and Dictator of Peru. A drove of pack animals carrying 72 trunks and over 400 chests with countless objects whose value had not been established. On that occasion, he had left in Quito more than 600 books which he had never attempted to recover. Bottom of page 31. It was almost 6 o'clock. The millenarian drizzle had stopped for a moment, but the world was still cloudy and cold, and the house, taken over by the troops, had begun to emit a foul barracks smell. The hussars and the grenadiers scrambled to their feet when they saw the taciturn general approaching from the end of the corridor, surrounded by his aides-de-camp and looking green in the light of dawn, his poncho thrown across his shoulder and his broad-brimmed hat making the shadows of his face even deeper. Following an old Andean superstition, he covered his mouth with a handkerchief soaked in cologne as protection against harmful drafts caused by abrupt exposure to the weather. He did not wear any insignia of his rank, and there was no trace left of the immense authority he had once possessed, but the magic halo of power distinguished him from the noisy retinue of officers. He walked toward the drawing room at an unhurried pace along the corridor, lined with straw matting that encircled the interior garden, indifferent to the soldiers of the guard who snapped to attention as he passed. Before entering the drawing room, he tucked the handkerchief into his cuff, as only clerics did now, and handed his hat to one of the aides-de-camp. In addition to those who had kept watch in the house, other civilians and soldiers had been arriving since dawn. They were drinking coffee in scattered groups, and their somber clothing and hushed voices had rarefied the atmosphere with a mournful solemnity. The sudden sharp voice of a diplomat rose above the whispers. "This looks like a funeral." No sooner had he spoken than he sensed the cloud of cologne saturating the air in the room behind him. Then he turned, holding a cup of steaming coffee between his thumb and forefinger, and he was disturbed by the thought that the phantom who had just walked in might have heard his impertinence. But no, although the general's last visit to Europe had been 24 years earlier, when he was very young, his fond European memories were sharper than his resentment. And so the diplomat was the first he approached, in order to greet him with the extreme courtesy he believed the English deserved. "I hope there is not much fog this fall in Hyde Park," he said. The diplomat experienced a moment's hesitation, for in recent days he had heard that the general was going to 3 different places, and none of them was London. But he recovered in an instant. "We will try to have the sun shining night and day for your excellency," he said. The new president was not there, for the Congress had elected him in absentia, and he would need more than a month to arrive from Popayan. In his stead was General Domingo Caicedo, the vice president-elect, of whom it had been said that any office in the Republic was too restrictive for him because he had the bearing and distinction of a king. The general greeted him with a great deference and said in jest, "Do you know I don't have permission to leave the country?" Everyone greeted his statement with laughter, although everyone knew it was not a joke. General Caicedo promised he would send a valid passport to Honda by the next post. The official delegation was composed of the Archbishop of the city and other notable men and high-ranking officials with their wives. The civilians wore chaps and the military wore riding boots, for their intention was to accompany the illustrious exile for several leagues. The general kissed the archbishop's ring and the lady's hands, and shook the gentlemen's hands without effusiveness, an absolute master of well-bred ceremony, but a total stranger to the kind favored in that ambiguous city, about which he had said on more than one occasion, "This isn't my theater." He greeted them all in turn as he walked through the room, and for each he had a phrase learned with all due deliberation in the manuals of etiquette, but he looked no one in the eye. His voice was metallic and cracked with fever, and his Caribbean accent, which so many years of travel and the tribulations of war had not softened, sounded even harsher compared to the lush diction of the Andeans. When he completed his greetings, the interim president handed him a paper signed by numerous distinguished New Granadans, expressing the nation's gratitude for so many years of service. In yet another tribute to local formality, he pretended to read it before the silent company, for he could not have seen it without spectacles and unless the handwriting were larger. And yet, when he pretended to have finished, he directed a few brief words of gratitude to the delegation, which were so appropriate to the occasion that no one could have said he had not read the document. Then he looked around the room, and without hiding a certain amount of concern, he asked, "Didn't Urdaneta come?" Come? The interim president informed him that General Rafael Urdaneta had left with the rebel troops in support of General Jose Laurencio Silva's precautionary mission. Then someone let his voice be heard above the others. "Sucre didn't come either." He could not ignore the malicious intention of that unsolicited report. His eyes, which had been dimmed and aloof until that moment, flashed with feverish intensity, and he replied, not knowing to whom. The field marshal of Ayacucho was not informed of the time of our departure, so as not to interfere with his mission. It was apparent he did not know that Field Marshal Sucre had returned 2 days earlier from his failed mission to Venezuela, where he had not been allowed to enter his own country. No one had told him the general was leaving, perhaps because it had not occurred to anyone that he was not the first to know. Jose Palacios learned this at a difficult moment, and then he forgot it in the confusion of their final days. He did not discount, of course, the dreadful idea that Field Marshal Sucre might feel resentful at not being informed. In the adjoining dining room, the table was laid with a splendid American breakfast: tamales in corn husks, blood sausage with rice, eggs scrambled in casserole, a rich variety of pastries on lace cloths, and pots of hot chocolate as thick as perfumed paste. The hosts had delayed breakfast in the event he agreed to preside over the table, although they knew that in the morning he took nothing but the infusion of poppies and gum arabic. In any case, the lady of the house fulfilled her obligations by inviting him to sit in the armchair reserved for him at the head of the table, but he declined the honor and addressed everyone with a formal smile. "My road is a long one," he said. "Enjoy your meal." He stood on tiptoe to take his leave of the interim president, who responded with an enormous embrace that allowed everyone to see how small the general's body was, how forsaken and defenseless he looked when it was time for farewells. Then he shook all the gentlemen's hands again and kissed the ladies' hands. Someone attempted to detain him until the weather cleared, although both of them knew it would not clear for the rest of the century. Moreover, his desire to leave without delay was so evident that attempting to keep him seemed an impertinence. The master of the house walked with him to the stables through the invisible drizzle in the garden. He had tried to assist the general by holding his arm with his fingertips as if it were made of glass, and he was amazed at the tension of the energy coursing beneath his skin like a secret torrent that bore no relationship to the impoverishment of his body. Representatives of the government, the diplomatic corps, and the armed forces, with mud up to their ankles and their cloaks soaked with rain, were waiting to accompany him on the first stage of his journey. No one was certain, however, who was there for the sake of friendship, who in order to protect him, and who to be sure that, in fact, he was leaving. The mule reserved for him was the best of a pack of 100 presented to the government by a Spanish merchant in exchange for canceling his indictment as a horse thief. The general already had his boot in the stirrup that the groom was holding for him when the Minister of the Army and Navy called to him. "Excellency!" He stood motionless, his foot still in the stirrup and both hands holding the saddle. "Stay," said the minister, "and make one final sacrifice to save our country." "No, Heron," he replied. "I no longer have a country to sacrifice for." It was the end. General Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolívar y Palacios was leaving forever. He had wrested from Spanish domination an empire 5 times more vast than all of Europe. He had led 20 years of wars to keep it free and united, and he had governed it with a firm hand until the week before. But when it was time to leave, he did not even take away with him the consolation that anyone believed in his departure. The only man with enough lucidity to know he really was going, and where he was going to, was the English diplomat, who wrote in an official report to his government. "The time he has left will hardly be enough for him to reach his grave." That's the end of chapter 1. All right, this is the beginning of chapter 2 on page 39. The first day's travel had been the most trying, and would have been even for someone less ill than he, for his mood had been twisted by the larval antagonism he sensed in the streets of Santa Fe de Bogota on the morning of his departure. The light was just beginning to penetrate the drizzle, and he encountered only a few stray cows along the way, but the rancor of his enemies hung heavy in the air. Despite the government's precautionary order that he be escorted through the quieter streets, the general still saw the insults painted on convent walls. Beside him rode Jose Palacios, who wore what he always wore, even in the heat of battle: the sacramental frock coat, the topaz pin in his silk tie, the kidskin gloves, and the brocade vest crossed by the chains of his 2 identical watches. The trimmings on his saddle were of Potosi silver, and his spurs were made of gold, and for this reason he had been mistaken for the president in more than one Indian village. Nevertheless, the diligence with which he attended to even the slightest whim of his master made any such confusion unthinkable. Jose Palacios knew and loved him so well he could feel in his own flesh the pain of this furtive departure from a city that at one time had made the mere announcement of his arrival reason enough for patriotic fiestas. Less than 3 years earlier, when he had returned from the arid southern wars, weighted down by more glory than any American, living or dead, had ever won before, he had been greeted by a history-making, spontaneous reception. Those were still the days when people would grasp his horse by the halter and stop him in the street to complain about public services or taxes, or to ask him for favors, or simply to feel themselves close to the radiance of greatness. He would pay as much attention to petitioners in the street as he did to the most serious matters of state, demonstrating a surprising knowledge of each one's domestic troubles, or the condition of his business, or the state of his health, and every man who spoke to him was left with the impression that he had shared for a moment in the joys of power. No one would have believed he was the same man, or that this taciturn place he was leaving forever, with all the wariness of an outlaw, was the same city. Nowhere had he felt so much a stranger as in those stiff, narrow streets, the identical houses with dark roofs and private gardens filled with sweet-smelling flowers, where, over a slow flame, a village community simmered whose affected manners and crafty speech hid more than they told. And nevertheless, although it might have seemed to him then a trick of the imagination, this was the same city of fog and icy winds he had selected long before he saw it as the place to build his glory, the same city he had loved more than any other, and had idealized as the center and reason of his life and the capital of half the world. When the final reckoning came, he seemed more surprised than anyone at the loss of his prestige. The government had posted hidden guards, even at the least dangerous locations, and this prevented a confrontation with the choleric gangs of hoodlums who had shot him in effigy the previous afternoon, but all along the route he could hear the same distant shout, "Skinny Shags!" The one soul who took pity on him was a beggar woman, who said as he passed by, "Go with God, phantom." No one showed any sign of hearing her. The general sank into a brooding gloom and rode on, lost to the world, until they came out onto the grandeur of the savannah. At Cuatro Esquinas, where the paved road began, Manuela Sanz, alone and on horseback, was waiting for the entourage to pass, and she kept her distance as she waved a last goodbye to the general. He waved back and continued on his way. They never saw each other again. The drizzle stopped a short while later. The sky turned radiant blue, and 2 snow-covered volcanoes remained at the same spot on the horizon for the rest of the day. But this time he displayed none of his passion for nature. He took no notice of either the villages they passed through at a steady trot, or the greetings of the people who did not recognize them. And yet what seemed most extraordinary to his companions was that he did not have so much as a tender glance for the magnificent herds of horses on the numerous breeding farms in the savannah, the sight, as he had often said, that he loved best in the world. In Facatativa, the village where they slept the first night, The general said goodbye to his spontaneous companions and continued the journey with his permanent entourage. There were 5 men, in addition to José Palacios. General José María Carreño, whose right arm had been amputated as the result of a wound received in combat, his Irish aide-de-camp, Colonel Belford Hinton Wilson, the son of Sir Robert Wilson, a general who had fought in almost all the wars of Europe, Fernando, his nephew, aide-de-camp, and clerk, who held the rank of lieutenant and was the son of his older brother, who had died in a shipwreck during the First Republic, his kinsman and aide-de-camp, Captain Andres Ibarra, whose right arm had been disabled by a saber cut during the assault of September 25th, 2 years before, and Colonel José de la Cruz Paredes, who had proven himself in countless campaigns for independence. Lots of Josés. The honor guard was composed of 100 hussars and grenadiers selected from the best of the Venezuelan contingent. José Palacios took special care of 2 dogs that had been taken as booty in Alto Peru. They were beautiful and brave and had served as watchdogs at a government house in Santa Fe de Bogota until 2 of their companions had been slashed to death on the night of the attempted assassination. On the interminable journeys from Lima to Quito, from Quito to Santa Fe de Bogota, from Santa Fe de Bogota to Caracas, and back again to Quito and Guayaquil, the 2 dogs had watched over the cargo, walking alongside the pack animals. They did the same on the final journey from Santa Fe de Bogota to Cartagena, although this time there was less cargo, and it was guarded by the troops. The general awoke in Facatavia in a bad temper, but his mood improved as they descended from the upland plateau through rolling hills, and the climate grew more temperate and the light less harsh. They invited him several times to rest, for his physical condition was cause for concern, but he preferred to go on, not stopping for lunch until they reached the hotlands. He often said that the motion of his horse helped him to think, and he would travel for days and nights on end, changing mounts several times so as not to ride them to death. He had the bowed legs of an old cavalryman, and the gait of those who sleep with their spurs on, and a callus as hard as a barber's leather strop had formed on his buttocks, earning him the honorable nickname Iron Ass. Since the beginning of the wars for independence, he had ridden 18,000 leagues, more than twice the distance around the world. No one had ever disproved the legend that he slept in the saddle. After midday, when they were already beginning to feel the hot breath rising up from the ravines, they agreed to rest in the cloister of a mission. The Mother Superior attended them in person, and a group of indigenous novices gave them marzipan fresh from the oven and a grainy corn masato to drink that was about to ferment. When she saw the column of sweating soldiers in their haphazard uniforms, the Mother Superior must have thought Colonel Wilson was the highest-ranking officer, perhaps because he was good-looking and blond, and wore the uniform with the best trimmings, and she concerned herself only with him, displaying a very feminine deference that provoked evil-minded comments. José Palacios did not disabuse her of her mistake, so that his master, wrapped in a wool blanket to sweat out his fever, could rest in the shade of the ceiba trees in the cloister. There he remained, not eating or sleeping, listening through a fog to New World love songs sung by the novices to the harp accompaniment of an older nun. When they finished, one of them walked through the cloister with a hat, begging alms for the mission. The nun with the harp said to her as she passed, "Don't ask the sick one for anything." But the novice took no notice. The general, without even looking at her, said with a bitter smile, "I'm the one who needs charity, my girl." Wilson gave from his own purse with so much generosity that he earned a cordial jest from his superior. "Now, Colonel, you see the price of glory." Wilson himself later expressed his surprise that no one at the mission or anywhere else along their route had recognized the best-known man in the New Republics. No doubt this was an unexpected lesson for the general as well. "I am no longer myself," he said. They spent the second night in an old tobacco factory that had been converted into lodgings for travelers near the village of Guaduas, where they were expected for a formal ceremony of regretful farewells which he refused to attend. The building was immense and gloomy, and its very location caused a peculiar malaise because of its untamed vegetation and the black precipitous waters of the river that hurtled in a thundering explosion down to the banana plantations in the hotlands. The general knew the spot, and his first time there he had said, "If I had to ambush someone to assassinate him, this is the place I would choose." He had shunned it on other occasions only because it reminded him of Berruecos, a sinister stretch on the road to Quito that even the most fearless travelers preferred to avoid. Once, against the judgment of all his men, he had made camp 2 leagues away because he did not think he could bear so much sorrow. But this time, despite his fatigue and fever, it seemed in every way more tolerable than the love feast of condolences his troubled friends in Guaduas had prepared for him. When the innkeeper saw him arrive in so grievous a state, he proposed sending for a local Indian who could cure a sick man, regardless of distance and sight unseen, just by smelling a shirt he had sweated into. The general laughed at his credulity and forbade his men to attempt any kind of dealings with the miracle-working Indian. If he had no faith in doctors, whom he called traffickers in other people's pain, he could not be expected to entrust his fate to a backwater spiritualist. And then, as further affirmation of his contempt for medical science, he refused the decent bedroom they had prepared for him because it was the one the most appropriate for the state of his health, and he ordered his hammock hung in the broad open gallery that faced the ravine, where he would be exposed to the dangers of the night air. Stubborn guy. Nothing had passed his lips that day except the infusion he drank at dawn, but he joined his officers at the table only for the sake of courtesy. Although he adapted better than anyone to the rigors of life in the field and was almost ascetic in his eating and drinking, he knew and appreciated the arts of the wine cellar and the kitchen as if he were a refined European, and beginning with his first trip abroad, he had learned from the French the custom of talking about food while he ate. That night he drank only half a glass of red wine and tasted the venison stew out of curiosity to see if what the innkeeper claimed and his officers confirmed was true, that the phosphorescent meat had the flavor of jasmines. He said no more than 2 sentences during the meal, and he did not say them with any more animation than the very few he had said during the journey, but they all held in high esteem his effort to sweeten the vinegar of his public misfortunes and poor health with a spoonful of good manners. A man who could not overcome the bitter gall of a grudge for years after the offense, he had not said another word about politics or alluded to any of Saturday's events. Before they finished eating, he asked to be excused, and shivering with fever, he put on his nightshirt and sleeping cap and collapsed into his hammock. The night was cool, and an enormous orange moon was beginning to rise between the hills, but he was in no frame of mind to look at it. The soldiers of his escort began to sing popular songs a few steps from the gallery. Following a standing order of his, they always encamped close to where he slept, like the legions of Julius Caesar, so he could learn from their conversations at night what they were thinking and feeling. His insomniac's wanderings had often taken him to where they slept in the field, and not a few dawns had found him in the soldiers singing barrack songs with the stanzas of praise or mockery they improvised in the heat of the fiesta. But that night he could not tolerate their singing, and he ordered them to be still. The eternal crashing of the river among the rocks was magnified by his fever, and became part of his delirium. "The fucking water!" he shouted. "If we could just stop it for a minute." But no, he could no longer stop the flow of rivers. Jose Palacios tried to calm him with one of the many palliatives they carried in the chest of medicines, but he refused it. That was the first time he was heard to say his recurrent phrase, "I've just renounced power because of an emetic that should not have been prescribed, and I'm not prepared to renounce life as well." Years before, he had said the same thing when another physician cured him of tertian fever with an arsenical mixture that almost killed him with dysentery. From that time on, the only medicines he accepted were the purgative pills he took without hesitation several times a week for his persistent constipation, and a senna enema for the most critical bouts of sluggishness. A short while after midnight, exhausted by his master's delirium, Jose Palacios stretched out on the bare brick floor and fell asleep. When he awoke, the general was not in his hammock, and his nightshirt, drenched with perspiration, lay on the floor. This was nothing out of the ordinary. When there was no one else in the house, he would leave his bed and wander naked until dawn, whiling away his insomnia. But that night there were more reasons than usual to fear for him. He had been ill all day, and the cool, damp weather was not the most propitious for his walking about unclothed. Propitious? Jose Palacios took a blanket and looked for him in the house that was lit by a lunar green, and he found him lying like a funerary statue on a stone bench built into the corridor wall. The general turned to him with a lucid gaze in which no trace of fever remained. This is another night like the one in San Juan de Payara," he said, "without Queen Maria Luisa, sad to say." Jose Palacios understood the allusion all too well. It referred to a January night in the year 1820, when the general and 2,000 troops had come to a remote spot on the upland plateaus of the Apure in Venezuela. He had already liberated 18 provinces from Spanish domination. He had created the Republic of Colombia out of the former territories of the Viceregency of New Granada, the Captaincy General of Venezuela, and the Presidency of Quito, and he was at the same time its first president and the commander-in-chief of its armies. His ultimate hope was to extend the war into the south in order to realize the fantastic dream of creating the largest country in the world, one nation free and unified from Mexico to Cape Horn. Nevertheless, his military situation that night was not the most favorable for dreaming. A sudden plague that struck down the animals in mid-stride had left behind a pestilential trail 14 leagues long of dead horses on the Llano plain. Many demoralized officers consoled themselves with rapine and reveled in their disobedience, and some even laughed when he threatened to have the guilty shot. 2,000 ragged and barefoot soldiers, without weapons, without food, without blankets, to defy the bleak upland plains, weary of wars and disease, had begun to desert in droves. For lack of a rational solution, he had ordered a reward of 10 pesos for any patrol that captured and turned in a deserter who would be shot with no questions asked. Life had already given him sufficient reasons for knowing that no defeat was the final one. Less than 2 years before, when he was lost with his troops in the not too distant jungles of the Orinoco, he had been obliged to give orders to eat the horses for fear the soldiers would eat each other. At that time, according to the testimony of an officer in the British Legion, he had the outlandish appearance of an exotic vagabond guerrilla. He wore the helmet of a Russian dragoon, a mule driver's espadrilles, a blue tunic with red trim and gold buttons, and he carried the black banner of a privateer hoisted on a plainsman's lance, the skull and crossbones superimposed on a motto in letters of blood, liberty or death. On the night in San Juan de Payara, his costume was less disreputable, but his situation was no better. And this reflected not only the momentary condition of his troops, but the entire drama of the liberating army, which often reemerged triumphant from the worst defeats and was nevertheless about to collapse under the weight of its many victories. On the other hand, the Spanish general Don Pablo Murillo, with all the resources to crush the patriots and restore the colonial order, still controlled large areas of western Venezuela and was entrenched in the mountains. Faced with this state of the world, the general tended to his insomnia by walking naked through the deserted rooms of the old hacienda mansion, which was transfigured by brilliant moonlight. Most of the horses that died the day before had been burned at a good distance from the house, but the stench of decay was still intolerable. The troops had not sung again after the death-ridden marches of the past week, and even he felt incapable of preventing the sentries from falling asleep with hunger. Then, all at once, at the end of a gallery open to the vast blue plains, he saw Queen Maria Luisa sitting on the floor, a beautiful mulatta in the flower of her youth, and with the profile of an idol. She was wrapped in a flower-embroidered shawl that reached down to her feet, and was smoking a long cigar. The sight of him frightened her, and she made a cross with her index finger and thumb and pointed it in his direction. "Whether you come from God or the devil," she said, "what do you want?" "You," he said. He smiled, and she was to remember the flash of his teeth in the moonlight. He embraced her with all his strength, holding her so she could not move while he nibbled with soft kisses at her forehead, her eyes, her cheeks, her neck, until he had quieted her. Then he removed the shawl, and it took his breath away. She, too, was naked, for her grandmother, who slept in the same room, took her clothes to keep her from going out to smoke, not realizing that at dawn she would escape wrapped in the shawl. The general carried her to the hammock, giving her no respite from his soothing kisses, and she gave herself to him not out of desire or love, but out of fear. She was a virgin. Only after she regained her courage did she say, "I'm a slave, sir." "Not any more," he said. "Love has made you free." In the morning, he bought her from the owner of the hacienda for 100 pesos, taken from his impoverished treasury, and granted her unconditional freedom. Before he left, he could not resist the temptation of presenting her with a public dilemma. He was in the back patio of the house with a group of officers who sat any way they could on the backs of pack animals, the only survivors of the slaughter. Another body of troops under the command of Brigadier General Jose Antonio Paez, who had arrived the night before, was assembled to see them off. The general gave a brief farewell speech, in which he underplayed the drama of the situation, and he was preparing to leave when he saw Queen Maria Luisa in her new condition as a free and well-wooed woman. She had just bathed, and under the Llano sky she looked beautiful and radiant, dressed all in starched white with the lace petticoats and skimpy blouse of a slave woman. He asked her with good humor, "Are you staying or coming with us?" She answered with an enchanting smile, "I'm staying, sir." Unanimous laughter greeted her reply. The master of the house, a Spaniard who was an early convert to the cause of independence and an old acquaintance, was helpless with laughter as he tossed him the little leather purse with the 100 pesos. He caught it in midair. "Keep them for the cause, Excellency," the Spaniard said. "The girl is free in any case." General Jose Antonio Paez, whose fawn-like expression harmonized with his shirt patched in many colors, burst into expansive laughter. "Now you see, General," he said, "this is what we get for acting like liberators." He assented to what they said and took his leave of everyone with a wide circle of his hand. Then he said a sportsmanlike goodbye to Queen Maria Luisa, and that was the last he heard of her. As far as Jose Palacios could remember, before a year of full moons had gone by, the general claimed he was reliving that night without the miraculous appearance of Queen Maria Luisa, sad to say, and always on a night of defeat. And I think that's where we will stop. Kind of finishes up with that little anecdote in the middle of this chapter. We're on the top of page 52, just like after one little sentence there. So if you're following along in a copy such as this, you can catch up with me next time on the top of page 52. So I hope to see you then. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Bye.